Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your April astrological forecast. We have quite a month ahead of us. I mean, we've been on a string of one crazy, incredible month after another, and April will not disappoint. Before we get to that, I would like to announce the winner of the free harmonic reading. And as many of you already know, every month we pick someone from my mailing list for a free reading on harmonics in their natal chart. And if you're not on the mailing list, you go to ricklevineastrologer.com and you can sign up for the mailing list there. This month's winner is number 4875. Every month, Gail uses a random number generator to to select one of the people on the list. 4875 this month is Suzanne Bedell. And Suzanne, congratulations, and you'll receive an email with further instructions. Now, also, I do have some announcements. For those of you who don't want to listen to them, you can go to the description and scroll down to the bottom where it says more, and there'll be a link there to go right to the place where I start the forecast. Please do not post forecast starts at such and such a time. I've already posted it. It will be there for those of you who don't want to listen to this part. But these are some of the things that I have coming up for those of you who are interested. I have quite a May and June in Europe, and I'm going to run through these pretty quickly. The links will be in the first comment below. That's not the description. You go down to the comments, and all of the clickable links for all the events that I mentioned will be down below. Before I get into those events, I should also mention that Astrology Night this month on the first Friday night of April is on April 4th. And that, of course, is at Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington. There will be a clickable link down below to take you to that live stream page. If you can't make it, if you are in the neighborhood, please stop by. It's going to be a big night. It's actually April 6th is my 76th birthday. And so this is going to be a combination of astrology night and a birthday celebration. So if you're in the Seattle or Redmond area, please stop in on Friday evening. For all others, you can join us on the live stream. It begins at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And if you can't make it, or if you're someplace on the planet where that's the middle of the night or too early in the morning, it will be up on my YouTube channel, and you can watch it at your convenience. So, I will be in London, and this will be a conference that I'm doing with, it's actually in Aubrey Park, St. Albans, Hempstead, kind of just north of London. And the name of this conference is Shifts Happen, because therapy doesn't do retrogrades. And this is a conference that I'll be doing with Steve Judd. Nick Campion will be giving a keynote speech, talk, and also Alex Trenoweth and Penny Thornton will be presenters there. It's really less of a conference than a symposium. There'll be a lot of interactive events or classes, and this will be on May 2nd through the 5th. And I know I'm going to see some of you there, and I hope to see others also. That's May 2nd through the 5th. The following weekend, I'll be at the 4th International Portuguese Astrology Conference in Porto, Portugal, and that's May 9th through the 12th. And these conferences have they're the largest Portuguese-speaking conference in the world, but they do have an English track. There'll be a number of either American, British, or other English-speaking astrologers giving talks. And the link, of course, will be down below. That's May 9th through the 12th in Porto, Portugal. The following weekend, I'll be doing some keynote presentations at the Happy Souls Festival. I love that name in Stockholm. That's going to be the Stockholm International Astrology Conference, and that will be on May 17th and 18th. And that's at happysoulsfestival.com. And I have a link to the English translation of that. Again, there will be lectures in English at this conference also. And that's May 17th and 18th. But on the 19th and 20th, also in Stockholm, I'm doing a 2-day workshop of bringing the planets down to Earth. And this is going to be deep astrology, taking your chart readings to the next level. It's going to be a small group, and I'm really excited because the interactivity that we'll have, all attendees will have their charts used as part of the teaching curriculum. And so if you're ready to take it to the next level, Stockholm, May 19th and 20th. And for that, you can just send me an email directly. Again, the link will be down below, and I'll give you further details on that 2-day workshop in Stockholm. On the weekend of May 31st and June 1st, I'll be doing a similar event of hands-on astrology. Again, small group of people. It will not be a large conference, but it'll also be in English. And this will be in Milan, Italy. And if you're interested in that, if you can make this event, send me an email and I will send you all the details and the information on that. That will be on Saturday and Sunday, May 31st and June 1st in Milan. The following weekend, I'm going to be at the Copenhagen Astrology Congress, giving a keynote address there and another class in addition. And that's going to be June 6th through 8th in Copenhagen. This is All-Time Astrology, is the name of the conference. I'm really excited about this one because the talk I'm giving is basically on the physics of metaphysics and astrology and quantum physics, quantum astrology. And of course, many of you would realize right away that quantum physics was really born in Copenhagen. It was Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, and Schrödinger and Heisenberg and all these great names. They all gathered in Copenhagen and they worked out the craziness that was occurring at the subatomic level. And so I am very honored to be giving this keynote address in Niels Bohr's hometown. That will be in Copenhagen, June 6th through 8th. And then I'll be doing a 2-day, again, hands-on natal chart interpretation workshop, and that will be on June 10th and 11th. And again, for these smaller group workshops, you just need to send me an email at rlevine@stariq.com, and I'll get you the full information on those. And that's Copenhagen, June 6th and 7th for the conference. And 10th and 11th for the actual hands-on chart interpretation workshop. Then very briefly later on in the summer, actually almost autumn, September 5th through 7th, I'll be doing also a keynote address for the Kepler College Symposium, and that's going to be in Niagara Falls, New York, and you can get more information on that at the Kepler College website, and again, I'll have the link down below. That's September 5th through 7th. There's going to be a number of the Kepler faculty will be there. We'll be doing mastery classes, a number of lectures, and that's going to be a really exciting weekend, September 5th through the 7th in Niagara Falls, New York. Then mid-October, October 15th through the 19th, I'm going to be doing one of the track leaders for the OPA. OPA is the Organization for Professional Astrology. and OPA held a conference last year in Park City, Utah. That's just up in the mountains outside of Salt Lake City at an amazing venue. And we're returning to that venue. And the link for that will be down below. These are small groups. These groups will be limited to, I think, 10 people in each group. It's 3 days of intensive work. These OPA conferences are very different. You sign up for one track, you work with one teacher for 3 days in a small group, and it really, really goes deep. So looking forward to seeing some of you there. And then the last event of the year, back to Goa. I'll be doing my last initiation into astrology, and this is November 20th through December 2nd. Many of you have heard me speak about this before because I've been doing these workshops, these retreats in the south end of Goa at an Ayurvedic healing spa for a number of years. It's an amazing place. Everything's included. Heavenandearthworkshops.com. And again, the link to the actual retreat is there. That's it. I know I cycled through those pretty quickly, but there's a lot of exciting events coming up, and especially for those of you who are in Europe or can get around either in England or in the UK or on the continent. There's a number of exciting venues that will be there. And with no further ado, let's jump into April. So we've made it through March. We've made it actually through 3 months of 2025 already. And I'd like to say that we're through the eye of the needle, but we're not. And this is a huge eye of a needle that we're threading our lives and even planet Earth, humanity through right now. I think if you've listened to other astrologers talking about April or talking about this time, our stories are pretty consistent. We've never seen a time like this or quite like this before. We're starting off April with Neptune having moved into Aries, and Mercury and Venus, both of which had moved into Aries, are now back in Pisces. We kind of have this crazy Pisces pile up through the end that we've seen through the end of March, and it continues through the first part of April. And, Pisces is a bit of a mixed blessing. In some ways, it's the most elevated, most spiritual, most magical, most creative, most imaginal sign in the zodiac. It's the most intuitive. It's the most psychically sensitive. But on the other hand, it's also a paradox because it is totally confusing. It's dissolving. It's hard to know where we are and where we're going. Neptune, is Neptune. Neptune is in Pisces, and Neptune, of course, is at home in Pisces, as is Jupiter. But Pisces has to do with the energy that dissolves what we think is real, including ourselves. We have what we refer to as our identity, our self-identity. I'm Rick, you're Frank or Susan or whomever. And this idea of self is tied up with ego, and we have a lot of cultural or maybe spiritual traditions that have to do with getting beyond our ego. Oh, that person's so full of themselves, they're so in their ego. But the thing is that without ego, we would have no self. Ego, as defined by psychoanalysis, Freud, is the function of basically maintaining our survival. So without an ego, we wouldn't have food on the table. We wouldn't have a roof over our head. We wouldn't be able to survive day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. And yet Pisces is this idea that when we move beyond ego, then that's where the magic happens. And in some ways it is, but it's this kind of paradoxical dance that we do between the three-dimensional reality and the psychic or psyche, the imaginal, the subconscious, the emotional, that reality which doesn't manifest in the three dimensions. So the big news, of course, of April is that for the first time in 165 years, Neptune, which spends about 14 years, 14, 15 years in each sign, for the first time in 165 years, Neptune has moved through Pisces, left Pisces, and is now touched into Aries. Let's actually shift gears and look at the chart for April 1st. So we can see that at noon on April 1st, and of course, as always, we're looking at an Aries rising chart, and which means that there's no houses, no ascendant, no midheaven, because as we move around the planet, the houses change. And so if I were to do a chart for here in Seattle, if you were in Topeka, Kansas, or in Delhi, India, the chart that you would be looking at would be very different. And so therefore, houses are just confusing when we do this type of global or mundane astrology. However, when we look at this chart for noon on April 1st here in Seattle, once you figure out how many time zones you are away from Pacific Daylight Time, once you figure that out, then the chart that you're looking at is good for that corrected time wherever you are on the planet. So at noon on April 1st, we can see that Neptune is at 0 degrees of Aries and 5 minutes, just barely tipped into Aries. It moved into Aries just a day and a half ago, almost 2 days ago now. But Neptune, of course, moves very, very, very slowly. Neptune moving into Aries is a big deal, and it's a long-term energy. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about Neptune and Aries, other than for the last 14 years, when Neptune was in Pisces, it was making it very difficult for us to know what was real and what was imagined. The dividing line between fact and fiction was pretty much dissolved as Neptune moved through its 14 years through Pisces. And of course, we can see that Saturn is at 24 degrees, about 24 and a half degrees of Pisces. And Saturn has been in Pisces since March of 2023. So it's been there for about 2 years now. And Saturn will be moving into Aries, kind of catching up to Neptune. It will be doing that in May. And then by June and July, with Saturn and Neptune both in Aries, they're going to get very close. They're almost going to join. They're going to get within minutes of arc. They'll be at the same degree, but they'll be within about less than a quarter of a degree to one another. And then Saturn turns retrograde and Neptune turns retrograde, and they both move back into Pisces. And then, of course, when they turn direct, having not quite perfected that conjunction, which happens about every 36 years, that they will then move forward and that conjunction will be perfected in February of next year of 2026. This is huge for a number of reasons. First, Neptune moving into Aries is huge because that's the beginning of the zodiac. That 0 degrees Aries point is it's a world point. It's a point of transition on planet Earth where the equinoxes occur, and that 0 degree Aries point is strong enough that in some schools of astrology, in Uranian astrology, for example, the 0 degrees Aries point is mapped on a chart as the Aries point, just as if it was like the north node of the moon, or or a planet. It's considered to be a real point. So Neptune hitting that is important, but doing it at the same time that Saturn is going to be making a conjunction. This is really what we're leading to, and it's not going to be until we get through that conjunction that we're really going to have a sense of where this is all going. Now, that's not quite a year out yet. That's in February of 2026, but there's so much action going on, and I think that to talk about specifics of what's around the corner is impossible because this corner, or maybe there are no corners, maybe it's just a really large curve. It's just too great of a curve. There are so many variables and so many unknowns. And I think the biggest variable is what you and I and each of us and everyone does between now and the next weeks and months and even up to a year ahead, because we are at a turning point, a major turning point. It's a death and rebirth. It's the end of one cycle. It's an end of a 165-year cycle that actually began when Neptune last moved into Aries from Pisces, within a day, within a day of the opening shots of the Civil War. Now, there were other aspects going on. I know there's a lot of people who are very concerned. I would say concerned about war, but look, we are in states of war. I say we humans all over the planet, whether it's in Northern Africa or in the Middle East, in Gaza, in politically, and wars, not only where people are actually fighting in real combat, but people are fighting for where humanity is going next. And that where humanity is going next, I'm not just talking about, in the next couple of weeks or for the next, few months. I'm talking about maybe forever, for a long time. We are at that kind of a point in our evolution where what we do over the next weeks, months, and year or so is going to solidify into a very long-term process. So, what does that mean now that we're going into April? Well, April, so we have Neptune now that's already stepped into Aries. There, Neptune is a fuzzy planet. I mean, that's its job. Its job is to melt the apparent surfaces of the three-dimensional world. Neptune's job is to melt away the hard edges of Saturn. And of course, when Saturn and Neptune join up, that's going to be a whole story. We'll be talking about that in the weeks and months and even the year or years ahead. But when Neptune moves into Aries, I think we become much more forceful, because Aries is about creativity. It's about, as I say creativity, I don't mean just from the mind creativity. It's that first urge, in spring, that first moment of Aries is when a seed germinates and there's a little shoot of green. That's that initial thrust. It's coming forward. It has no idea where it's going or what it's doing. It's just working on this primal energy of be born, of grow, of express. And when you look at something that's just poking through the ground, and it's just germinated in that first beginning of Aries moment of spring, so to speak, it's almost impossible to know whether what's growing is an oak tree or or a dandelion. It's just a little nudge of green. And that's where we are in this process. It's like a newborn that has its life in front of it, and it's impossible to know where that life will lead. We can say, well, if it takes the course of least resistance, this is what might happen. But there is the whole idea that astrology is not something that is written in stone. It's basically altered every moment of our lives by the awareness, the consciousness, the actions that we either take or don't take. And so that's why this moment, and when I say this moment, I mean April of 2025. I mean, March, April, May of 2025. I mean, 2024, 2025, 2026. I mean, we're at such a large change that we can actually say that the birth that humanity, or the rebirth, the evolutionary transformation that humanity is going through now, is also tied up to Pluto's transition from Capricorn into Aquarius, which has been going on now for a couple of years. And we could also say it's also tied, even going back to the 1960s, of the conjunction between Uranus and Pluto back in the mid-60s. The transition we're going through might be looked back at several hundred years into the future as the transition bigger than the industrial age, maybe that began with the industrial age, but that changed humanity from what it was in the past to what it will become in the future. Have a lot more to say about this over the months ahead, because this brings up issues of augmented reality. It brings up issues of artificial intelligence or artificial superintelligence. It brings up issues of technology. It brings up issues of control, of authoritative governments, of fascism even. It brings up issues of where we fit into our ancient history, and even into the history of the universe or the cosmos itself, in relationship to intelligences that may be way outside of our normal spectrum of perception, whether they are from the future or from different places in our galaxy or other galaxies. I mean, we are at the very beginning of a ride. It's taken us, several or let me say several millennia, thousands of years to get to where we are right now. And here's the important thing. The important thing is that keeping our minds on these longer trajectories is a way of not getting overwhelmed by the apparency of what's occurring in our individual lives, in our individual governments, in corporations, in our social structures, on the planet itself. And I feel like I've been just beating this message for months now, that things that are occurring are not where we're going. Things that are occurring are important, and they're important to pay attention to. But we're seeing the last hurrah, the last struggle to maintain something that we had in the past that we're moving away from. And evolution is evolution. It's going to move on. I'm sure that there were monkeys and or Neanderthals that did not want to harness fire, or that did not want to grow in awareness. What's happening is on that level of evolutionary transformation, and it scares the hell out of people, enough that many people just want things to return to the way they were. Ain't gonna happen. So here we are on April 1st, and as we can see, Neptune has moved already into Aries, but Mercury and Venus have both retrograded back into Pisces. And I think one of the issues of this month is going to be dealing with these retrograde Mercury and Venus energies, because Mercury turns direct on April 7th and Venus turns direct on April 12th. Mars actually turned retrograde back at the beginning of December, and then it turned direct on February 23rd. Now we're going to get into Mars's story a bit more, because Mars is one of the key players of this month, because Mars has been moving forward all through March, but it's now picked up speed. It's picking up speed more and more daily, and Mars is actually going to move. So let's actually go back and trace Mars's energy here just for a moment, because Mars actually entered the sign of Cancer back last September. Normally, Mars whizzes through a sign in about 8 weeks, 7 weeks, just a little bit less than 2 months. But Mars moved into Cancer at the beginning of September, where we pulled our energy in, became more protective of homeland, of our security, of home and family, more defensive rather than offensive, wanting to protect what we had. Um, Mars then touched into Leo just a couple of days, actually on November 3rd. So this was part of the presidential election when Mars popped into Leo on November 3rd, and it also opposed Pluto. Now, Mars and Pluto have a story between the two of them because Pluto is considered to be the higher octave of Mars. And in some ways, Mars was once traditionally is the ruler, is at home in Aries and Scorpio. And now in modern astrology, we say that Pluto is at home in Scorpio also. So Pluto is as the higher octave of Mars. There's an affinity. Mars is hot. It's the warrior. It's even the lover, but it's that intense energy. It's passion, whether it's fighting or loving. But Pluto takes that energy and it sustains it. Pluto is more not about a fight, but it's about the war. It's, a war can have many battles in it, but Pluto is the process of what happens through 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 years of a process. And in fact, the changes of Pluto are powerful and gradual. Pluto has to do with everything that's underground, everything that's hidden. In the ancient world, those people who owned what was underground were immensely wealthy. This is gold and silver and diamonds and copper and in modern times it's oil. And it's also wealth that is hidden, meaning the invisible wealth, like people who own the electromagnetic spectrum, which is where the huge amounts of wealth is now, not in the Saturnian worlds of real estate, but in cellular spectrums of information processing. So when Mars and Pluto get into a process, into a fight, into an engagement, this is some serious shit. This is really, really powerful. And Mars and Pluto together often correspond with deep, intense power structures where things come from hidden realms that we didn't know were there, that were that strong, that powerful. And when Mars and Pluto were opposed to one another, just as Mars was moving from Cancer into Leo, just prior to the presidential election. This is part of what set up that energy. I mean, I know it's been going on. It's not like it's not like this was the origin factor of the bifurcation of the polarity that we have, not only in the United States, but all over the planet. But that Mars-Pluto opposition was part of the energy that was going on during the U.S. presidential election, and the role that Pluto, hidden wealth, power, there's a lot of talk about the United States being an oligarchy, like Russia now, where very wealthy people are basically owning the government and sitting in the highest positions of power, whether it's president or the director of Doge or various cabinet positions or whatever. But there's a better word than oligarchy, and that's a plutocracy. Because a plutocracy is not just the wealthy people, it's the people who have such immense wealth that it's hidden, that the power is buried, like the wealth that was buried underground. And so when Mars opposed Pluto back right around Election Day, we saw this standoff where, in fact, hidden wealth probably had a huge amount to do with the outcome of that election. Money that was being spent to influence people by ads or even by votes. So then Mars turned retrograde at the beginning of December, and it moved back into Cancer at the very beginning of January. And so when Mars retrograded um, back into Cancer, just prior to it making that retrograde, just a couple of days prior to it, it opposed Pluto, which of course has recently moved into Aquarius. And so we had that second setup of that power struggle between Mars and Pluto. And of course, that was all part and parcel of the energy of January that culminated in the inauguration of Donald Trump. And then Mars continued to um, retrograde until the end of February, when it then turned direct. And now Mars is moving direct. And what this means is that Mars is replaying so many of the aspects that it made going all the way back to last September. In other words, we had Mars, for example, making a trine with Saturn toward the end of September. And then on the retrograde, Mars made another trine with Saturn on February 9th. Now that Mars is moving direct, it will make its third and final trine to Saturn on April 4th. And we're going to jump here in a moment to April 4th, because that is really the first, I would say, significant day. It is an incredibly potent and powerful day. But even here on the 1st, we can see that Mars at 23, almost 24 degrees of Cancer is making a trine with Saturn at 24.5 degrees of Pisces. But we also have Venus retrograding back toward its conjunction with Saturn. That will then, it will make a trine also to Mars. And so we can see this Mars, Saturn, Venus thing building, but there's a few other pieces to this puzzle that makes this so complicated, so powerful, and yet I want to step through it slowly, because I think this is one of the reasons why it's so important to pay attention to what's going on and to participate in what's going on, because where we're going to be is going to be determined by what unfolds in these days and weeks and months ahead. So here we are on April 1st again. We also can see that at noon on April 1st, that the moon was at 29 degrees of Taurus, having just conjoined with Uranus earlier in the day. But the moon actually moves into Gemini at 1:25 p.m. today. And when I say today, I'm always referring to the date of the chart we are looking at. And we are now looking at the chart for noon of April 1st. So the moon moves into Gemini at 1:25 p.m. today. I'm going to move this ahead just a day at a time. And we can see that when we move from April 1st to April 2nd, we can see now that the moon is in Gemini. Mid-afternoon, the moon will join up with Jupiter, and that will, I think, kind of ease the energy a little bit here. But we have other things that are going on, and that is that Mars is moving closer and closer to its exact perfected trine to Saturn, its third and final trine to Saturn, but it's also moving closer and closer to its square to Eris. Now, we talked about Mars and Pluto. Let's bring Eris into the equation here, because Eris is it's a KBO, a Kuiper Belt object. It's on the same astrological significance as Pluto. It's about a 500-year orbit, but Eris is Mars's sister. So we have another warrior planet here. But Eris is less interested in starting a fight and leaving it, like Mars, or less interested in starting something and then staying with the process and watching the evolution of it. That would be Pluto, the transformation. Eris likes to sow discord and start things so that it can become obvious what needs to be healed in order to be reintegrated into the process. Now, the reason why Eris is so significant is that we can see that Saturn is at 24 degrees of Pisces, Mars is at 24 degrees of Cancer, and Eris is at 24, almost 25 degrees of Aries. We also have a Chiron Eris conjunction that is building, and we'll have more to say on that later on. I don't want to get sidetracked too much. I want to just stick with the Mars Eris Saturn, and Uranus is in this picture also. And we can see that as we move this ahead another day, the moon at noon on April 3rd, the moon is now in is still in Gemini, but on the 3rd, that's Thursday, the 3rd at 3:49 p.m., the moon moves from Gemini into Cancer. That's on the 3rd. And when that happens, we may settle our energies down a little bit. We want to pull in, we want to be protective of ourselves and our feelings and our loved ones. And that moon over the next couple of days is going to move closer and closer to Mars, which is very significant because Mars is moving closer and closer to its trine to Saturn. Venus is retrograding back closer and closer to its trine to Mars. At the same time, we have Saturn and Eris making a half of a sextile. And we also have Saturn and Uranus coming into a sextile. You can see here that it's only minutes apart on the 3rd. As we move to the 4th, we can see now that the moon has moved into Cancer. And now we have some perfected aspects. And I think that the days leading up to this are going to be intense. And so is this day also. Here's the list of aspects that we have on April 4th. I mean, April 4th is just crazy. First of all, we have Saturn sextiling Uranus, which is a very important aspect because it's the first of 3 occurrences of this aspect that in many ways is going to be it's going to be our saving grace. It's going to be the way that we get through this. And I think it's very, very significant. Let me get you the other dates on the Saturn-Uranus sextile. The first exact Saturn-Uranus sextile is on here today on April 4th. Then on the retrogrades, it's exact again in August, on August 11th. And there's a lot of other stuff going on in August, including the fact that Uranus will have moved out of Taurus and into Gemini. But on August 11th is the second of those 3. And then the third and final one will be on January 19th of 2026. Normally, Saturn and Uranus are very different energies. I mean, mythologically, Saturn and Uranus, father son with castration. I mean, it was not a pretty picture. And but you can think of them as Saturn the old, Uranus the new. Saturn holding on to the status quo because it's stable, and Uranus upsetting the apple cart just because it's unstable and because that way new things can occur. Uranus is breakthroughs. Uranus is the future. Saturn is authority, and Uranus is the radical rebellion against authority. It's revolution. We've come through a couple of years, mostly 2021, when Saturn and Uranus were square. And this was high levels of disruption and authority versus the refusal to acknowledge authority, especially at the unfolding of the quarantine years. And but now we have Saturn and Uranus coming into a sextile, and sextiles are not just a get out of free jail card. They're basically someone's unlocked the jail cell. It gives us an opportunity, but if we don't do something about it, we'll just stay in jail and not and just stay there. Saturn sextile to Uranus is really it's about the cooperation of the past and the future. It's the opportunity to take the revolutionary breakthrough ideas of Uranus and work them into the old structures Saturn. You know, it's also this idea of giving structure Saturn to the unstable revolutionary energy that's involved. And so we have an opportunity here for the old and the new, for the various, how do I say this? I wanted to say it without being political, but I'm going to say with the red and the blue, with the conservative and the progressive, here figures out a way that it realizes that there's an opportunity. And I've said this before, and I'll say this again, that at this point in time, we're seeing absolutely a disintegration, that would be Neptune, of the two-party structured system, that would be Saturn, because what's going to come out of this is the realization that we're all in this together. And as long as the right hand and the left hand, or the progressives and the conservatives, or the this race and that race, or the haves and the have-nots, or the men and the women, or as long as there are people fighting against each other, divided we will fall. We're either going to make it out of this together, or we're not together. And so we're either all going to be losers, or we're going to have to figure out how to get along with each other enough to realize that we've been pitted against each other, and the other is not the enemy. The enemy is this hidden plutocracy that is basically working at a completely different level than what appears to be the fight on the surface. So Eris is being squared. Now we're back to April. Like I said, April 4th is a complicated day. And on April 4th, we have the exact perfection of the first of three Saturn sextile Uranuses. We also have Saturn making a half of a sextile, a semi-sextile to Eris, and Uranus from the other side is making a half a sextile to Eris. In other words, Eris, who mythologically threw the golden apple into the wedding that created this disruption that kind of started the Battle of Troy. But what's happening here is that there's definitely stuff going on that is creating an immediate disruption, because we also have on the same day Mars making a sextile with Uranus. Mars at 24 Cancer making a sextile with Uranus, which is basically the radical, that would be Uranus, expression of force or physical energy, assertion, direction. That would be Mars. Mars still in Cancer. It's still doing this from a defensive, not an assertive, aggressive manner. But Mars is also on April 4th making its third and final trine with Saturn, giving tremendous organization and the ability to take complex systems and actually through discipline and control to work with them. And at the same time that Mars is making a square with Eris. So we have just a crazy dynamic day. I think April 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th are going to be rock and roll days, and we'll see how that plays out. But by the 5th, Venus, which is backing into its conjunction with Saturn, that conjunction with Saturn is exact on the 7th, Venus-Saturn conjunction, and that Venus-Saturn conjunction is really with us the entire month. In fact, back on the 1st of the month, Venus and Saturn were just maybe a little bit over 2 degrees apart. And at the end of the month, they're still barely just a couple of degrees apart. By the end of the month, Venus just tweaks into Aries on the last day of the month. But Saturn and Venus are still just 2.5 degrees apart. And so we're going to come back and talk about Saturn and Venus in just a few minutes when we get to the 7th. But you can see here that Venus is now retrograding not only into its conjunction with Saturn, but Mercury is coming back into that same mix. And Mercury is backing up, but Mercury is barely moving now because it will then turn direct on April 7th, the same day that Venus lines up with Saturn. So we have here on the 5th, the moon moving into its conjunction with Mars, which means that the moon will be sextiling Uranus, it will be squaring Eris, and it will be trining Mercury and Venus and Saturn while it's moving toward its conjunction that will happen on the afternoon of Saturday, April 5th. Intense, powerful, intense, powerful. Then we move to the 6th. Happy birthday, Rick. My 76th birthday. I've been hearing the music all week. In the Music Man, there's a song, 76 Trombones that lead the big parade. I've been hearing that song again and again and again. It is my 76th birthday. But we have the moon actually moving into Leo late in the evening on the 5th. And so here on the 6th, we can see that the moon is now already past its conjunction with Mars, and it's actually moved into Leo where it opposed Pluto. And we have this Pluto thing building because now that Mars is moving direct, it will gain speed. And as Mars moves later in the month from Cancer into Leo, it's going to oppose Pluto. And that's going to be the third and final Mars-Pluto opposition. Again, the first one was right around Election Day. The second one was at the beginning of the year in January. And this is kind of going to, I mean, I remember back in the November forecast saying that whatever happens on Election Day, it ain't over, because we have to play this all the way through this Mars opposition Pluto and to see where this is actually going to be heading. That's on the 6th. Now on the 6th, we also have the Sun mid-Aries making an exact sextile with Jupiter. This can feel a bit of a reprieve. There's some positive energy here. There's that sense here of the Venus-Mars trine, which is exact on the 6th. There's that sense that there's hope, there's positive energy here. The Sun sextile Jupiter, there's potential for breaking through in a positive way. We still have that Saturn sextiling Uranus and Mars sextiling Uranus. So I think that there is hope here, but there's a lot of energy going on. On the 7th, we have the moon continuing to move through Leo. Now we have the exact Saturn conjunct. This is the retrograde Venus conjuncting Saturn. And that Saturn-Venus conjunction, I said I would talk a little bit more about it, and I will now. This Saturn-Venus conjunction is one of those aspects because of the retrograde that will actually happen 3 times. And this happens again and again during this month, where we get this 1, 2, 3 energy. This will be the second of the 3 times. We can go back again to Inauguration Day, actually just a couple of days prior to Inauguration Day, back January 20th, January 18th, Venus was exactly joined up with Saturn, exact. And when Venus joins up with Saturn, that was the first time. The second time is here on April 7th, today. And then Venus will station direct, and it will do that on April 12th. And then it will join Saturn exactly for the third and final time on May 24th. But here's the deal. It doesn't get far enough away from Saturn all month. well, I'll keep coming back to look how close Venus and Saturn still are, even though they're exact while Venus is retrograding over Saturn. Here on the 7th, it will be exact on the 24th. They will not get far away from one another. Um, so, what does Venus and Saturn together mean? Well, Venus and Saturn normally don't do that well together because Venus is warm and sweet, and Venus is pleasure. Venus is attraction. Saturn is hard edges. Saturn is cold. Saturn is discipline. Venus says, let's, because this is pleasing. This feels good. Saturn says, no, you can't, because authority, the church, the government, dad says that's not okay. Saturn says no. Venus says, please. It's normally a difficult relationship. When you see Saturn and Venus together, though, I mean, we can feel this as just it's not worth it. It's not worth trying to be nice. It's not worth being in a relationship. When we have Saturn Venus connections, it's just, we can feel isolated. We can feel like Saturn. It's like we've been having the best time of our lives, and then the police arrive, or dad arrives, or we have to go to church the next day and confess. Saturn basically is like, it's like throwing the cold water. It's like Debbie Downer. It's like it's like putting out the fire of pleasure. And of course, Venus and Mercury and Saturn are all being trined by Mars. So we have the energy, we have the fire, but Saturn is cooling the energy. Now, that sounds awful, but there's an upside to it. And that is that often Mars burns too hot and too fast. Often Venus, the attraction desire, especially when it's sextiling Uranus, which it's doing now, and trining Mars, can burn so hot and fast that we end up getting into trouble. We end up doing things that we wish we didn't, that we wish we wouldn't have done, because now there's consequences. And Saturn is there holding that energy back. Saturn forces discipline. Saturn says, it feels like everything's going down in this moment. It feels like if I don't act now, I'll never get a chance to. That's what the Venus and Mars and Eris and Uranus are all saying. But Saturn in the picture is saying, whoa, if you think about this and do this right, you can have really lasting impact. And I think that's what April is about. I think April is about, how do we act in ways that don't just blow the energy off, in just some random act of either rebellion or excitement or something. How do we acknowledge that we're in this for the long haul, and that we're going to be revisiting this Saturn Venus again on April 24th, and that all of this is tied up in April. There's so much energy in April that's part of other energies because of the Mercury and Venus retrograde and then turning direct, and because of the because of the Mars moving direct faster and then replaying some of its aspects. But even Jupiter, which is moving now pretty quickly, is going to make an aspect that we'll get to later in the month. That aspect is Jupiter making a square and a half with Pluto, and that's on the 17th. We're going to come back to that one in just a few minutes also. All right, I know we got a lot of ground to cover. Want to move this now from the 7th. Oh, and of course, the other thing here on the 7th is that Mercury is ending its retrograde period. Mercury having turned Mercury having turned retrograde on March 14th, is now turning direct on April 7th. Mercury was in Pisces back in the middle of it was Valentine's Day. It was on February 14th. And then it moved into Aries the beginning of March. Mid-March, it turned retrograde. It moved back into Pisces the end of March on the 29th. And here on the 15th, it turns direct. I'm sorry, on the 7th, it turns direct. And then on the 15th, it moves back into Aries. So we have such a dynamic dance. And I know I mentioned this in the in the March forecast about how Mercury and Venus were both going into Aries and back into Pisces and then back into Aries. Neptune was moving into Aries. It'll move back into Pisces later this summer and then back into Aries again. And the same with Saturn on a slower level also. And so these backward and forward dances are just going on again and again and again. And we're right in the midst of it right now with what's going on here on April 7th, as Mercury ends its retrograde period to turn direct, and Mercury doesn't enter Aries until April 15th. And again, remember, Venus enters Aries on April 30th. So by the end of the month, we're going to be in new ground, or at least we're going to be moving forward, but we won't, those planets will not be out of their shadows yet. That will be, we'll save that for May. Okay. April 8th, relatively quiet day. Venus does make that semi-sextile with Eris, and Eris is still in the picture. All those other aspects are still so close. In fact, the Venus, Saturn, Mercury, all sextile to Uranus with Eris at the midpoint. Even Chiron that's in there is close enough to matter, which is going to bring our sense of wounds and old hurts, and that we have something to learn in all of this. And Mars is still there also, because remember that Mars is moving forward, but now Mercury is moving forward, having already made the trine, but Venus will then turn direct, and it will also make that trine later on. So again, that's April 8th. Oh, and the moon moves into Virgo midday on April 8th. It does that at, actually did it this morning at 6:39 a.m. The moon entered Virgo. And while the moon is in Virgo over the next couple of days, it's going to oppose all the planets in Pisces, kind of creating this dynamic of, do we melt or do we pull in and create edge? There's this Saturn, thing, the moon opposing Saturn, that'll happen in a couple of days. Let's here move to the 9th. We can see that the moon moves onward. As we move through the 9th, the moon moving through Virgo is going to square Jupiter. And then by the 10th, the moon will catch up to the nodal axis, having gone in the morning opposition to Venus, Saturn, and then reaching that Mercury. Mercury direct now is connecting up with the nodes. We've had, and I didn't mention that earlier, but back in March, we had Neptune on the nodes, and we now have Mercury and Venus when it turns direct, and Saturn, it moving direct, will all be going over that nodal axis here with the moon doing it. Even though we're out of eclipse season, April 10th is still carrying a lot of intensity, especially also as the sun is moving closer and closer to its conjunctions with Chiron and Eris. The sun conjuncts Chiron on the 12th. The moon moves into Libra. Also, on the 10th, later in the day, the moon moves into Libra at 6:11 p.m. On the 11th, we can see the moon is now in Libra, having already opposed Neptune. There's a lot of conflict, a lot of tension as the moon is moving from Virgo into Libra, opposing all the planets in Pisces and Aries. And that will continue even into the 12th, when we have the sun making its exact conjunction with Chiron at the same time as the full moon in Libra, which is at 5:22 p.m. And that full moon in Libra at 5:22 p.m. is at 23 degrees, 23 and a third degrees of Libra and Aries, which is at the same degree as Chiron. And so here we may feel the restriction of the fear of something that's happened before, whether our fear of what's happened before, whether it be an emotional wound or a physical illness, or even a historical illness from from nearly a century ago. There's that feeling like a fear that something is back that we didn't really fix or cure. And yet the positive thing about this full moon is that we do have the potential to fix and or to cure it. Also, on the day of the full moon, just within an hour, within a half an hour of the full moon, we have Venus now making its direct station. So Venus, which is still only a degree away from Saturn, it's just barely a degree away from Saturn, is now turning direct, and we're going to come back into its conjunction. So this feeling of isolation and of unable to find pleasure and of just having to deal with things, it doesn't go away. It's going to be, I wouldn't say frustrating. I think it's just going to be a bit demoralizing. And yet, the solution to this is being aware of it, and also being aware that we can't be distracted by what appears to be going on. We need to keep our eye on the future of where we want this to go, and begin to do little corrections hour by hour, day by day, week by week, even month by month as we're allowed, because this will transform. And it is in that process. But it's hard to see a birth when you're still in the process of death. And the two of them are ongoing right now, almost simultaneously, almost going back and forth from Pisces to Aries, from ending to beginning, from direct to retrograde to direct, to illusion to fact, to breakthrough, to hold back. This is what we're dealing with right now. And what's happening in the real world is just a reflection of this. So then we move ahead. The moon moves into Scorpio on the 13th. It does that at 6:54 a.m. And when the moon moves into Scorpio by midday, the moon is going to be squaring Pluto. Now, before the moon moves from Libra into Scorpio, while it's still at the very tail end of Scorpio, it's going to be making a square to Mars, which is now at the tail end of Cancer. Remember, Mars is moving into Leo on the 17th, so we're only 4 days away from that. But the moon, like a sweep second hand, is first making the full moon opposing Chiron and then opposing Eris, while it then squares Mars. These are all engagement, conflict. Again, there's power struggles that are building here. And the power struggle that's really building behind everything is Mars making its third and final opposition to Pluto, which is not exact until the 26th. But as the moon moves from Libra into Scorpio, and it opposes first the full moon and then opposes Eris, squares Mars. Once it moves into Scorpio, it starts picking up on its square to Pluto, and we're getting waves and tastes and flavors of what's around the bend. And it may not feel comfortable. It may not be a good deal at all. And then on the 14th, we have the sun making its annual conjunction with Eris. And so again, we have more of this energy that can be quite disruptive, disorderly, chaotic even. And the moon now we can see in mid-Scorpio on the Tuesday, the 15th, as the moon moves towards the end of Scorpio. It makes a grand water trine. You can see here midday at noon on Tuesday, the moon is at 26 degrees of Scorpio. So in the morning, the moon will make quincunxes to Chiron and Eris and the sun. exacerbating that chiron, which is still in the middle of that uh, of the sextile between Uranus and Saturn, with Venus still there. Mercury's kind of pushed away from it a little bit. But as the moon moves through that same territory, the moon is going to be making trines with first Venus, then with Saturn, then with Mercury and Mars at 29 degrees of water. And then the moon will move from, on the 15th, from Scorpio into Sagittarius at 7:37 p.m. Oh, it's 7:37 is an airplane. And as the moon moves into Sagittarius, it's fitting. At 7:37, it might feel like we're finally taking off. But we will see how that plays out. That is on the 15th. We also have Mercury the same day, later in the day, not until 11:25 p.m. But the same day we have Mercury moving direct now, moving into Aries, which would normally be a real shot in the arm. And we're also going to, just a couple days away now from Mars moving into Libra. And so as the moon moves into Sagittarius, and then Mercury moves into fire Sagittarius, Mercury moves into fire Aries, and Mars moves into fire Leo, this is huge. This is like a real bolt, except, or maybe it's, and in addition, each of those planets makes exact trines with Neptune. I mean, the moon trines Neptune as it moves into Sagittarius. Mars will trine Neptune. It's already so close as it moves into Leo. And Mercury joins Neptune as it moves into Aries. And so even though we get the shot in the arm, it's also a bit complicated because we don't know exactly what the heck's going on. That moon is also opposing Uranus. I mean, again, these days, one after another, it doesn't let up. It doesn't let up. That's the 15th. The Mercury, which moves into Aries on the 15th late, actually catches up with Neptune on the 16th, later in the day at 9 p.m., 9-ish p.m. And so even though we're getting movement forward and we're feeling like things are moving ahead, we're also a bit confused by, I think, maybe how fast things are unfolding. That's on the 16th that Mercury makes its exact conjunction with Neptune. By the 17th, you can see Mercury is now past Neptune. But on the 17th, we have another aspect that's kind of sitting in the background. We're feeling it all month, but it is there. And what that aspect is Jupiter making a square and a half with Pluto. Now, the Jupiter-Pluto sesqui-square, or square and a half, is not an aspect that a lot of people talk about in great detail, in great depth. But I think it's quite important because semi-squares, half squares, and sesqui-squares, square and a halves, are like the same engagement that happens with a square, except it's more focused. It's more poignant. That's not the word I'm looking for. It has a narrower focus, so it motivates us to do something. And this Jupiter sesqui-square to Pluto has really been in operation since last August. Jupiter made its first of 3 sesqui-squares to Pluto back at the beginning of August, when we were in the early stages of the craziness of the presidential election. It made its second sesqui-square on December 12th. And so this is now after the presidential election, but it makes its third and final sesqui-square. This is Jupiter and Pluto on April 17th. Jupiter is expansive. It's the growth. It's the opportunity. Jupiter is the rewards that we get when we've done the right things, or when we've worked hard, or when we've had enough Saturn discipline to hold that energy in. Jupiter is the payoff. Jupiter isn't easy to work with, although easier than Saturn, because Jupiter says yes. Jupiter encourages, but we can overextend or overexpand. Incidentally, during the 3 maximum COVID breakouts in numbers during 2020 and into 2021, those were all aligned with Jupiter-Pluto conjunctions. But now we have the Jupiter-Pluto sesqui-square, and it says something about things from the deep, the power struggle, the hidden, the occulted, the transformation that isn't obvious, the caterpillar that's not yet a butterfly in process. That energy is all kind of, it's stirring up. And the interesting thing here on the 17th, as that aspect is exact, we have the moon going through Sagittarius opposing, making an opposition to Jupiter and making a half square to Pluto, almost stirring that energy up another whole notch. And so what is this going to be? I think this is a gradual unfolding, but the Jupiter-Pluto here, I think, is setting us up for the Mars opposition to Pluto, which occurs next week. And also we have one other thing going on with Jupiter this year, that's Jupiter with Saturn, that is not exact this month. But back when Jupiter was making its square and a half to Pluto last August, Jupiter was also making a square to Saturn. Now, Jupiter square Saturn is the halfway in any decade, because Jupiter and Saturn oppose and conjoin on the decade starting years. So they were conjoined in 2020, and they will oppose in 2030. And halfway between, Jupiter and Saturn are square, and Jupiter is expansion, Saturn's contraction. Jupiter is go for it, make it bigger. Saturn is pull back, make it the way it was. Jupiter is encouraging, and Saturn is restricting. But Saturn also is the discipline that we have to put in order to be allowed to grow Jupiter. So Jupiter squared Saturn back in August, when Jupiter was also making that square and a half to Pluto. Jupiter squared Saturn a second time on Christmas Eve of 2024. So this again is still that whole expansion contraction dance that we're doing culturally. And Jupiter will make its third and final square to Saturn in mid-June. Now, I know that aspect is not exact now, but it's all part of this Jupiter and Jupiter-Pluto thing that again just adds to the complexity of the times that we are in. That is April 17th. As we move to the 18th, we can see that on Friday the 18th, the moon moves into Capricorn at 7:12 a.m. But we have some conflict here. We're kind of getting another dose of Saturn, a sobering kind of like reality check here as the moon moves into Capricorn, and we maybe focus a little bit more on the plans that we need to put into motion to make things real. On the 19th, on Saturday, the moon is still moving through Capricorn, but now we have Mars. And Mars is already in Leo. In fact, I didn't mention this on the 18th. We had Mars actually move from Cancer into Leo. And as Mars moved into Leo, it starts playing on its trine to Neptune, which is now in Aries. And here, as you can see, on the 19th, the sun at 29 degrees and 58 minutes at noon, it moves into Taurus just an hour later. And that is on the 19th. So we have the beginning of the Taurus season. And we also have on the 19th, Mars making the exact trine with Neptune. So a couple of things here. Taurus is about steady growth. Taurus is a sign of Venus. And so Venus is still lined up with Saturn. We still are not getting what we want. In fact, Venus and Saturn are now both getting closer and closer to the nodes. I mean, they're like right there. Saturn lines up with the nodes on the 21st, and Venus lines up with the nodes on the 23rd. And again, these are time vortexes. But we also have Mars making that trine to Neptune. Now, Mars, because of the direct retrograde direct, it made a trine to Neptune back at the end of October. So this is coming into the presidential election. Mars actually made a square to Eris, a sextile to Uranus, a trine to Neptune, um, and then an opposition to Pluto, all leading up to and then right around the presidential, leading up to the presidential election. Then Mars played all of those in reverse when it went retrograde throughout January. And in fact, on Inauguration Day, Mars was squaring Eris for the second time. And this was just the apparent disorder, the golden apple being thrown into the wedding. But this is all through January, retrograde Mars making all of those aspects again. Then, as Mars turned direct, and we already talked about this, Mars made its third and final trine to Saturn, its third and final square to Eris, and its third and final sextile to Uranus, all on April 4th. It then, on April 19th, makes its third and final trine to Neptune. So this again is confusing, as it was at the end of October, as it was again through January, and the actual House of Representatives, validating the presidential election leading up to inauguration. But we have some replay here of what's going on as we move through this period of time, and Mars makes that trine to Neptune, and in fact, it's hard to know what's real. That's on the 19th. I mean, it continues even on the 20th. Both Venus and Mercury on the 20th, we can see now that the sun is now firmly in Taurus, and Venus makes a sextile on the 20th, 11:20 a.m. with Uranus, and Mercury makes a sextile with Pluto. There's some positive energy here, but it's opportunity. Venus, Uranus. There's something exciting that is cooking. It's out of the box. But we have to reach for it. And whether we should or shouldn't it's a hard call. Saturn is still sextiling Uranus, but Venus now whizzes through that. But right now we have this whole energy building, and it really is, again, intense and crazy here on the 20th, as Venus makes the sextile to Uranus, and Mercury makes a sextile to Pluto, as the moon is coming into its conjunction with Pluto. Here on the 20th, the moon moves into Aquarius at 4:21 p.m. And so then it'll be about another 8 hours when the moon actually finally lines up with Pluto, while Mercury is making a sextile to Pluto, which is bringing up deep, intense, hidden communication out into the open. That Mercury in Aries now, it's speaking its mind. It's kind of moving away from Neptune. I think we're getting a little bit of clarity, or at least it feels that way, and things are being spoken. We have energy that is really unfolding here. Things are moving quickly. On the 20th, we also have the sun making an exact square to Mars. It does that in the evening at 6:33 p.m. And so this is a fiery, feisty day. I mean, Mars is still within orb of opposing Pluto. I mean, this can be a day where there is release of energy, where there's assertion, where there's aggression, and there may be a mistake made because it's Mars trining Neptune that's still in the mix. Complicated energy. This is on the 20th. By the 21st, Saturn lines up with the North Node. And so again, these are time warps. These are tying back to the eclipse energy, but it's also tying back to the fact that it's hard to know that what's happening now is now, because there's almost like wormholes into the past and into the future when planets line up with the nodal points. That's on the 21st. On the 22nd, late in the evening, the moon moves into Pisces. You can see here at noon, it's still at 24 degrees of Aquarius, but the moon moves into Pisces at 10:06 p.m. today on the 22nd. And we can also see now that the sun in Taurus is moving closer and closer to its square to Pluto. That is exact on the 23rd. And we can now see that Mars is still within all orb of all of this. Mars is still being squared by the sun as the sun is squaring Pluto, and Mars is still opposing Pluto. These are dangerous times. It's hard to know how we are going to work with this energy. We'll be revisiting this, of course, on the mid-month update for those of you at the solar level. That's the $3 a month. We'll be zoning in on this a lot more because these are really significant times. On the 24th, the sun makes a half square with Jupiter. And again, this may be overstepping our bounds. This may be too much. It's the moon in it's the sun in Taurus. And the sun in Taurus has a sense of determination and steadiness to it. But it's as it makes that half square with Jupiter, that's exact at 9:28 p.m. on the 24th, we may overdo something. We may not necessarily recognize the limits that we have. Now, notice that Venus and Saturn are still conjoined. I mean, that I mentioned that is again and again and again, but now they are back to being exact here for the third and final time on the 24th. And again, it's that feeling of isolation, that feeling of not being able to have as much fun as we want to have. And then we push ahead. The moon now moving through Pisces is going to catch up on the 24th later in the day with the nodal axis Venus and Saturn. And then early in the morning on the 25th, actually just at 12:23 a.m., the moon will move into Aries. And so just after midnight, the moon will move into Aries, line up with Neptune, and by midday, the moon is already almost lining up with Mercury. Communication is emphasized here. Again, it feels like we're moving into, things are moving fast. Things may be out of control, and that part may be difficult to take. But we also have on the 25th. Look how close Mars is now opposing Pluto. It's just a half a degree of orb. As we move to the 26th, there Mars is in opposition to Pluto. The sun is still within orb of squaring both Mars and Pluto. Again, these are complicated and dangerous times, but we have to keep our eye on the ball. We have to pay attention to what's happening, and we have to know that however difficult this may be, this in some ways, is such a critical time that we have to be ready to swing into action, to call our congressmen, our senators, to be active, to talk to people, not in violence, not in hate, but in actually trying to figure out how we are all going to work this out, because we're not going to be successful if we are in battle with one another. Also on the 26th, we can see that the moon is now catching up to, by later in the afternoon, it joins up with Chiron and Eris. It's a fiery, feisty moon, and the moon actually moves into Taurus just after midnight on the 27th. On Sunday, there's the moon now moving into Taurus, and by midday, actually 12:31 p.m. on the 27th, we have the new moon in Taurus. This is a break in the energy. This is something new. This is something different. Even though we still have the remnants of the Mars opposing Pluto, and that power struggle is still playing out, there's now a solidity. There's something has settled in, for better and or for worse. It ain't over, but it feels like that there's some kind of settling down or settling in, even if the energy feels uncomfortable. We also can see that although Venus is past its conjunction with Saturn, it's still only a degree apart. And as we move this forward, let's see, this is on the 27th. Oh, and we also have Mercury making a half square with Uranus, which means that things can be said that can't be retracted. There's a bit of a danger here on this new moon. I mean, we're planting the seed for what it is that comes over the next month. And some of that is about growth, it's about stability, it's about regrounding, it's about not being so crazy. And yet at the same time, Mercury making a half square, a semi-square to Uranus, is someone saying something crazy. Things are being said that we can't take back, and that can complicate the issue even further. And that Mercury semi-square Uranus happens at 7:58 this morning, just before the new moon, which again is the chart that we're looking at now at 12:31 p.m. The new moon at 7 degrees Taurus and 47 minutes. Um, and and we can see also that Venus is just about ready to change signs. Now we can see midday that the moon is still in Taurus, but now it's lining up with Uranus. It'll do that mid-afternoon Pacific time. We still have Mars opposing Pluto. It's still like within less than 1 degree of orb. That energy is there. With the moon conjuncting Uranus today, there can be a little bit of wild energy that just comes out of nowhere. And then on the 29th, also on the 28th, we have the moon moving into Gemini at 11:34 p.m. When we jump here to the 29th, we can see that the moon now is almost 8 degrees, 7 degrees, but almost 8 degrees of Gemini, having made a trine with Pluto, and also having made a sextile with Mars, maybe alleviating that energy a little bit finally. Maybe things are really beginning to settle down a bit. But then on the 30th, midday, the moon is lining up with Jupiter. Again, overextension, overindulgence. But we can also see now that Venus has left Pisces. The energy here by the end of the month is totally different. We're in a different world. Saturn is still at the end of the month lingering back at Pisces. Here it's almost 28 degrees of Pisces. Saturn actually tips into Aries the end of May, just for a couple of months. June, July, August, September, it's back into Pisces again. And then it'll move back into Aries next February, when it makes the exact conjunction at 0 degrees of Aries with Neptune. But here at the end of the month, the only thing that's holding us back into Pisces is Saturn, and everything else has moved on. I mean, we're now kind of in this fiery energy of Venus, Neptune, Mercury, Chiron, Eris, all in fiery, fire starter, assertive, aggressive Aries. Mars in put it on the show light, put it on stage, dramatically express it with intention, fixed intention. Mars having moved into Leo, and then we have the Moon and Jupiter and Pluto in air. We've lost almost all of our water, and we still have the Sun and Uranus lingering in Taurus, but they will both move into Gemini soon enough. The Sun in May, and then Uranus will move out of Taurus and into Gemini, and it'll do that in July. So changes are unfolding. They're unfolding crazy fast. I know there was a lot of details this month, but I've never seen a month quite like this. I know I said that last month with the eclipses and with all the other stuff that happened last month with the retrogrades. But April is one that we will remember for a long time. Just keep in mind, we can't be distracted by thinking that what's going on is what's going to last. We're seeing totally out of whack, out of balance energy, and I don't know how it's going to play out. But I do know, and I feel like a broken record saying this again and again, that we all have to figure out ways in which we can engage, even if we're thinking as cosmically as we want to about what we idealize or what we hope will be life on planet Earth in a year or 5 years or 10 years. We have to, when thinking cosmically, we have to act locally. We have to bring our energy back to keeping our lives together. Remember, you can't pour water out of your cup to share with someone else if you have no water in your cup. Whatever it takes to do, whatever it takes to survive, that's what we need to do. These are times where the energy is a bit extreme. And of course, that ancient Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. And it was not a nice thing to say to someone, it was intended as a curse. We are living in interesting times. Hang in there, do what you can to keep it together, keep breathing, keep moving one foot forward after another, and it's okay to be disillusioned, meaning paying attention to what's real, but it's not okay to become discouraged because we have to keep we have to keep courage, we have to keep what's in our heart alive because we will need it. We need it now. And so that's it for now. I'll see many of you mid-month, and I hope to see some of you in Europe throughout the next month, throughout May. And that's it. Peace be with all of us.